I want you to think about the word aesthetic. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot these days. Usually it's harmless. It refers to a Pinterest board, or the color grading of an Instagram feed, or the vibe of a coffee shop that charges $9 for a latte. But in the world of old money, deep Southern wealth, and hyper-controlling matriarchs, aesthetic is not a harmless word. It is a weapon. It is a very polite, very socially acceptable way of saying, you do not belong here, and I am going to make sure everyone knows it. My name is Simone. I am a woman who takes up space. I am plus size, and I have been for my entire adult life. I am also highly educated, deeply ambitious, and relentlessly observant. I do not apologize for my body. I do not shrink to make other people comfortable. And when someone tries to force me to shrink, I don't scream. I don't throw a tantrum. I don't give them the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I get quiet, and then I get to work. This is the story of how my mother-in-law, a woman whose entire existence revolved around the curation of her family's perfect visual image, decided that my body was a blemish on her annual family portrait. It is the story of how she deliberately, publicly humiliated me in front of 30 people by banishing me to the back row, hidden behind distant cousins, because I ruined the aesthetic of her golden family. And most importantly, it is the story of how that single superficial decision cost her exactly 1/3 of the multi-million-dollar landscaping and property management empire her family had spent 3 decades building. Let me take you back to the beginning. I met Marcus when we were both 25. He was the kind of man who seemed inherently relaxed in a world that was constantly stressed. He was handsome, deeply kind, and completely unbothered by the superficial markers of status that usually plague men of his background. His background, as I would soon discover, was formidable. The Whitfield family practically owned the upscale landscaping and property management market in a 60-mile radius of Charlotte, North Carolina. They didn't just mow lawns, they designed and maintained the sprawling estates of athletes, executives, and old money aristocrats. They were wealthy, established, and intensely protective of their image. Marcus and I fell in love easily. We just fit. I was a financial analyst, grounded in numbers and reality, and he was the operational backbone of his family's company, grounded in the earth. We balanced each other perfectly. For the first year of our relationship, we existed in a bubble of our own making. I didn't spend much time with his family, and when I did, it was in large, chaotic settings where the sheer volume of people masked any underlying tension. But bubbles always burst. And mine burst the day Marcus officially introduced me to his mother, Eleanor Whitfield, as the woman he intended to marry. Eleanor was a woman who looked like she had been carved from expensive marble. She was thin, rigidly elegant, and possessed a gaze that felt like a physical appraisal. She didn't look at you, she inventoried you. I remember our first official dinner at the Whitfield estate in Huntersville. The house was massive, an architectural marvel of white columns and sweeping manicured lawns that looked like they belonged on the cover of Southern Living. Eleanor greeted me at the door, her eyes sweeping over my body with an almost clinical detachment. She didn't flinch, she didn't sneer, but I saw the micro-calculation in her eyes. I saw the immediate, silent judgment that I was not what she had envisioned for her son. I was not a size 2. I did not have the frail, delicate bone structure of the country club girls she had spent years parading in front of Marcus. I had hips, I had thighs, I had a presence that could not be tucked neatly into the background of a cocktail party. Simone, Eleanor had said, her voice dripping with that specific brand of southern sweetness that actually tastes like poison. Welcome to our home. Marcus has told us so much about your intellect. Not my beauty, not my charm, my intellect. It was the first strike, subtle but clear. You are smart, but you are not decorative. Over the next 2 years, the microaggressions escalated. They were never overt enough to cause a screaming match, but they were a constant, steady drumbeat of disapproval. When we announced our engagement, Eleanor insisted on accompanying me to look at wedding dresses. I knew it was a bad idea, but Marcus had practically begged me to include her, hoping it would bond us. We went to a high-end boutique in Charlotte. I tried on a stunning, form-fitting mermaid gown that highlighted every curve of my body. I felt beautiful, I felt powerful. I stepped out of the dressing room, and Eleanor simply stared at me from her plush velvet chair, a small, tight smile playing on her lips. "It's very brave," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet boutique. I looked at her in the mirror. Brave? Well, dear, not everyone would have the confidence to wear something so unforgiving. It certainly draws the eye directly to your, lower half. But if you're comfortable making that kind of statement, I suppose that's all that matters. She didn't say the word fat. She didn't have to. The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I ended up buying an A-line dress that I loved slightly less, but that offered the kind of coverage that made Eleanor stop offering her helpful commentary. It was a compromise I made for Marcus's sake, to keep the peace. I realize now that peace with a woman like Eleanor is an illusion. You are either compliant, or you are an enemy. The wedding went off without a hitch, mostly because I paid a wedding planner an exorbitant amount of money to act as a buffer between me and Eleanor. Marcus and I settled into married life. We were happy. We bought our own home. I advanced in my career, and Marcus continued to run the daily operations of Whitfield Property and Landscape Group alongside his father, Gerald, and his older brother, Donovan. Donovan was a carbon copy of Eleanor. He was entirely consumed by status, image, and the ruthless pursuit of more. Donovan had married a woman named Priscilla, who was the exact manifestation of Eleanor's wildest dreams. Priscilla was a former pageant queen, aggressively thin, blonde, and possessing the personality of a highly decorative houseplant. Priscilla was the golden daughter-in-law. I was the dark horse, the wild card, the girl who was too smart, too loud, and entirely too big. But I didn't care. I didn't need to be Eleanor's favorite. I had Marcus, I had my career, and I had my own life. I thought that as long as I maintained a polite distance, the Whitfield family dynamics couldn't truly touch me. I was wrong. I fundamentally misunderstood the depth of Eleanor's obsession with control and the lengths she would go to in order to maintain the flawless veneer of her family's image. The Whitfield family had a tradition. Every October, on the first Saturday of the month, the entire extended family gathered at the Huntersville estate for the annual family portrait. This was not a casual iPhones on a tripod situation. This was a highly orchestrated, professionally photographed, meticulously styled event. The resulting photograph would be framed in the grand foyer of the estate, sent out as the family's annual holiday card to over 500 high-net-worth clients, and prominently featured in the company's end-of-year newsletter under the heading, "The Whitfield Family, a Legacy of Excellence." It was, in essence, a massive marketing campaign disguised as a family tradition, and Eleanor was the creative director. The dress code was always dictated months in advance. One year it was navy and cream, another year charcoal and blush. This particular year, the color palette was deep autumnal jewel tones: emerald green, sapphire blue, rich plum, and dark burgundy. I had spent weeks searching for the perfect dress. I wanted something that fit the dress code but also made me feel like myself. I finally found it in a boutique in Atlanta while on a business trip. It was a custom-made, heavy silk crepe dress in a shade of dark burgundy that looked like spilled wine. It had a tailored bodice, a sweeping skirt, and it fit me like a glove. It was expensive, it was elegant, and it made me feel invincible. I brought it home, tried it on for Marcus, and watched his jaw drop. "You look incredible," he said, pulling me in by the waist. "My mom is going to lose her mind when she sees you in that. It perfectly matches the theme." "That's the goal," I said, kissing him. Flawless compliance. I'm going to out aesthetic, her aesthetic. I should have known better. You cannot beat a game master at a game they invented. The morning of the portrait was a crisp, perfect North Carolina October day. The leaves were just beginning to turn. The sky was a piercing blue, and the air smelled like wood smoke and expensive perfume. Marcus and I arrived at the estate at 10 o'clock sharp. The sprawling front lawn was already chaotic with relatives. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandchildren milled about, holding cups of coffee and wearing various shades of jewel tones. Kezia, the high-end photographer Eleanor hired every year, was setting up her lighting rigs and tripods near the massive oak tree that anchored the front of the property. Kezia was known for her editorial style. She shot for local magazines and commanded a day rate that made my eyes water. I walked onto the lawn feeling genuinely confident. My burgundy dress moved beautifully as I walked. My hair was styled in loose waves. My makeup was flawless. I caught a few appreciative glances from Marcus's cousins. I felt good. I felt like I belonged. And then, I saw Eleanor. She was standing near Kezia holding a clipboard. Yes, An actual clipboard. She was wearing an emerald green structured suit that looked sharp enough to draw blood. She was deep in conversation with Priscilla, who was wearing a sapphire blue slip dress that clung to her size 0 frame like a second skin. Eleanor turned and saw me. The clipboard lowered slightly. Her eyes performed their customary scan, starting at the hem of my burgundy dress and traveling up to my face. The scan took slightly longer than usual. I saw the flicker of annoyance in her expression. It wasn't because I looked bad. It was because I looked good. I looked regal. And I took up space. Simone, Eleanor said smoothly, her voice carrying over the chatter. You made it. And that dress. Well, it certainly is a lot of fabric. It's silk crepe, I said smoothly, not letting the smile drop from my face. Good morning, Eleanor. Right. Well, let's get everyone organized, shall we? Eleanor clapped her hands together, the sound sharp and authoritative. Listen up, everyone. Kezia is ready to begin setting the formation. We need the core family members up front, please. Gerald, Marcus, Donovan, Priscilla, and the children. Notice the names she omitted. I didn't immediately react. It's common in large family photos to arrange people by height or to group core family members in specific ways. I assumed she just hadn't read my name off the top of her head. I walked forward with Marcus, heading toward the cluster of wooden chairs Kezia had arranged in a gentle arc. Gerald, Marcus's father, took the center chair. He was a quiet man who generally deferred to Eleanor in all matters not directly related to landscaping equipment or corporate finance. Donovan stood to his father's right, tall and imposing. Priscilla was directed to sit in the chair immediately to Donovan's right. Her thin legs crossed elegantly at the ankle, her 3 children clustered perfectly at her knees like cherubs in a Renaissance painting. Marcus was directed to stand to his father's left. I moved to stand beside him. Eleanor stepped forward, her hand raised. Oh, Simone, dear, stop right there, she said. I froze. The entire lawn seemed to go quiet. The chatter of the extended relatives died down. Kezia, look at the monitor, Eleanor said, pointing a manicured finger at the photographer's digital screen. Look at the balance on the left side. Kezia, a professional who clearly recognized the danger of getting involved in family politics, looked at the screen and hesitated. It's a bit heavy on the left, Mrs. Whitfield. The visual weight is pulling. Exactly, Eleanor said. She turned back to me, her face a mask of faux sympathy. Simone, sweetheart, you're blocking the line of the oak tree, and that color on you combined with the overall volume of your silhouette. It's just pulling focus from the center line. It's ruining the symmetry. The volume of my silhouette. She didn't say fat. She said volume. I can turn to the side, I offered, my voice remarkably steady despite the sudden roaring hum in my ears. I knew exactly what was happening. 30 people were watching. My husband was standing 3 feet away. No, that won't fix the balance issue, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with that toxic sweetness. We really need a sleeker line in the front row. The aesthetic we're going for this year is very streamlined. Very tailored. She gestured toward Priscilla's rail-thin frame as an example of streamlined. Why don't you step back, dear? Eleanor continued, gesturing with her clipboard toward the very last row of relatives, where the teenage cousins and elderly uncles were standing. Just tuck yourself in behind Cousin David. You'll still be in the shot, but the darker color of your dress will blend into the shadows of the tree. It will help anchor the background without disrupting the focal point. Blend into the shadows, tuck yourself in. Without disrupting the focal point, the translation was glaringly obvious to every single person on that lawn. You are too big, you are too fat, you do not look like a Whitfield. Hide yourself in the back so you don't ruin my picture. The word aesthetic hit me like a physical blow. It was the door of a vault slamming shut, locking me out. I stood there on the manicured grass, the autumn breeze suddenly feeling like ice. I didn't look at Priscilla, who was busy smoothing the sapphire silk over her non-existent thighs. I didn't look at the cousins, who were suddenly incredibly interested in their shoes. I looked at the front row, Gerald, Eleanor, Marcus, Donovan, Priscilla. 3 blonde, perfectly styled children arranged at their parents' knees like a composition from a glossy magazine. There was no chair for me in the front row. There had never been a chair for me. Not really. I had just been naive enough to believe that being married to Marcus meant I had earned a place there. But to Eleanor, marriage wasn't an induction into the family, it was an audition, and my body had just failed the screen test. I turned my eyes to Marcus, my husband, the man who told me I was beautiful every single morning, the man who had held me while I cried over job rejections, who had promised to stand by me in sickness and in health. I looked at him, waiting for him to step forward, waiting for him to take my hand, waiting for him to say, "If my wife sits in the back, I sit in the back," or better yet, "We aren't doing this, Mom." Marcus looked at the lawn. He didn't meet my eyes. His jaw was tight, a muscle ticking near his ear, but he didn't move, he didn't speak. He stared at a patch of clover near the toe of his expensive Italian loafer, entirely paralyzed by a lifetime of conditioning that dictated one simple rule: you do not ruin Eleanor's aesthetic, and you do not ruin Eleanor's picture. In that agonizing silent span of 5 seconds, I learned everything I would ever need to know about my husband's spine and his mother's power. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't cause a scene. Causing a scene would have validated Eleanor's core belief that I was unrefined and unworthy. If I had shouted, she would have played the victim. She would have sighed and said, "Oh, Simone is just so emotional. So unstable." I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing my hands down the heavy, beautiful silk of my burgundy dress. I looked directly at Eleanor. I held her gaze until she was the one who almost looked away. "Of course," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, a whisper that somehow carried across the entire silent lawn. And then I turned and walked to the back row. I found my assigned spot in the shadows. I stood in the far corner, tucked behind a tall teenage cousin I had met exactly once, and an elderly great-uncle who smelled strongly of peppermint schnapps and kept leaning over to ask me if I was the new accountant for the landscaping business. "No, Uncle Henry," I murmured softly. "Just family." Kezia, looking visibly relieved that the crisis had been averted without bloodshed, began snapping photos. The process took 40 excruciating minutes. "Smile, everyone," Kezia called out. "Look like you love each other." I smiled. I smiled when Eleanor directed Kezia to take a series of small, intimate group shots of the core family and didn't once call my name. I smiled when Priscilla was pulled front and center for a 3-generation photo with the children, her sapphire dress gleaming in the October sun. I smiled as I stood entirely ignored in the background, a large, dark shape relegated to the periphery. I smiled the way a predator smiles when it finally spots the weak point in the fence. I didn't feel hurt anymore. The hurt had burned off, evaporating into something much colder, much harder, and infinitely more dangerous. I felt a profound, crystal-clear sense of clarity. Eleanor had drawn the battle lines. She had made it abundantly clear that in her empire I was a second-class citizen, a footnote, an unfortunate visual anomaly to be hidden away. But Eleanor had forgotten one crucial detail. I was a financial analyst. I understood the architecture of empires better than the people who built them. When the session finally ended, I didn't stick around for the catered brunch spread on the patio. I touched Marcus's arm lightly. "I have a migraine," I said, my voice flat. "Take me home." He looked at my face, saw the absolute void in my eyes, and didn't argue. On the drive back to Charlotte, the silence in the car was suffocating. We were 10 minutes down the highway, the autumn trees blurring past my window in streaks of gold and rust, when Marcus finally couldn't take it anymore. "Simone," he started, his voice cracking slightly. I'm so sorry. I didn't know she was going to do that. I swear to you, I had no idea she was going to arrange it like that. I should have said something." I didn't turn to look at him. I kept my eyes on the passing trees. "You heard her," I said evenly. "Yes," he admitted, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "I heard her." "It was terrible." "And you looked at the lawn." Silence descended again, heavy, accusatory, indisputable. He couldn't deny it because he knew I had seen it. In the moment I needed him to be a husband, he had chosen to be a son. "I panicked," he whispered. "You know how she gets? If I had pushed back, she would have ruined the entire day. She would have made it a massive fight. I froze. I'm sorry." "I know you froze, Marcus," I said, my tone completely devoid of anger. That was the terrifying part. I wasn't angry, I was calculating. But apologies don't change the seating arrangement. I let him sit in his guilt for another 3 miles. I needed him soft. I needed him desperate to make it right. Because I was about to ask him for something massive, and I needed him to say yes without thinking too hard about the consequences. Marcus, I said, finally turning my head to look at his profile, I need to ask you a question. He looked at me quickly, eager for any chance at redemption. Anything, do you own the company? He blinked, clearly thrown by the pivot away from his mother's cruelty. What? On paper, I clarified, my voice brisk and professional. Whitfield Property and Landscape Group. Is your name actually on the corporate registration? Are you a legal beneficiary in the asset trust? Marcus frowned, his brow furrowing as he mentally shifted from emotional panic to business logistics. Yes, of course, the business is held in the Whitfield Family Trust. The trust is divided into equal thirds. My father, my brother Donovan, and me. We each hold a 33.3% ownership stake. Why? I studied his face. He was an honest man, but he was legally naive. Because, I said slowly, letting the words hang in the air between us, I think it is time to restructure the ownership documentation, and I think you should let me help you do it. Here is something most people do not understand about corporate asset restructuring, specifically in the state of North Carolina. If a business owner adds a spouse to the ownership trust of a family LLC and the marriage has no prenuptial exclusions or prior legal firewalls, that spouse immediately holds equal legal rights to that specific asset in the event of a divorce, a partnership dispute, or a corporate dissolution. Marcus and I had no prenuptial agreement. Eleanor had actually suggested it, of course. Delicate, pointed suggestions made over tea about 3 months before our wedding. Protecting the family legacy, she had called it. Standard protocol. Marcus, in a rare display of defiance, had refused her. He told his mother that he loved me, trusted me implicitly, and found the idea of a prenup insulting to our relationship. That had been one of the few times I had seen him draw a hard line with Eleanor. At the time, sitting in our small apartment, I had thought it was incredibly romantic. I had cried and kissed him for defending us. Later, sitting at my desk with 3 monitors glowing in the dark, I understood that his refusal was also structurally, legally, and financially spectacular. Over the next week, I did not cry over the photograph. I did not complain to my friends. I did what I do professionally. I researched. I pored over state corporate law. I reviewed the public filings for Whitfield Property and Landscape Group. Because Marcus trusted me completely, and because he was still drowning in guilt over his failure to defend me on the lawn, he gave me unrestricted access to the private Whitfield Family Trust documentation. He thought I was just looking for a way to secure our personal financial future, to make sure we were protected in case Eleanor decided to try and financially penalize him for marrying me. He didn't realize I was drafting a weapon. The trust was remarkably straightforward, almost archaic in its simplicity. 3 co-owners, Gerald, Donovan, and Marcus. The company itself was registered as a family LLC operating underneath the umbrella of the trust. There was no exclusionary clause preventing spouses from transfer eligibility. There was no stipulation requiring a majority vote to transfer an existing stake into a joint marital asset. Gerald and Donovan had built the trust under the assumption that the Whitfield men would always fall in line. They never accounted for a Whitfield wife who knew how to read the fine print. I drafted a new document. I was careful. It was not a hostile takeover. It was not a lawsuit or a legal threat. It was a simple, impeccably clean ownership restructuring proposal. In it, Marcus voluntarily transferred his 1/3 stake in the Whitfield Family Trust out of his sole name and into a newly created joint asset trust held equally under both our names. The Marcus and Simone Whitfield Joint Holdings LLC. It was entirely legal. It was entirely standard for married couples consolidating their assets for tax purposes or estate planning. It was something that happens every single day in family businesses across the country. But in the context of the Whitfield empire, it was an absolute nuclear bomb. By signing that document, Marcus would be legally inserting me, the fat back row daughter-in-law who ruined the aesthetic, into the highest tier of the company's ownership. I wouldn't just be his wife. I would be a co-owner of 33% of Eleanor's precious legacy. She wouldn't be able to sell the company, liquidate assets, or restructure the board without my legal consent. I printed the documents on thick, heavy stock paper. I placed them in a leather folder, and I waited for the right moment. I presented it to Marcus over dinner on a Wednesday, 12 days after the portrait incident. The house was quiet. I poured him a glass of expensive bourbon, sat across from him at the dining table, and slid the leather folder toward him. "What's this?" he asked, taking a sip of the bourbon. It's a transfer of asset documentation, I said, my voice perfectly level. I've been reviewing the family trust. Marcus, right now, everything you own in that company is tied up in a structure that your mother functionally controls through your father and Donovan. If anything ever happened, our personal household has no legal firewall. This document takes your one-third stake and moves it into a joint trust. It protects us. It makes us equal partners on paper. Marcus opened the folder. He read the first page. He read the second page. He was a smart man. He understood the terminology. He understood exactly what this meant. He stopped reading and looked up at me. His eyes were wide, a mixture of awe and slight terror. Simone, he said slowly, this would mean my name and your name on the company. Yes. This legally binds you to the Whitfield Family Trust as a joint entity. Yes. He swallowed hard. Eleanor would absolutely lose her mind. If Donovan sees this filing— Marcus, I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of everything that had happened over the last 3 years. Eleanor sat me in the back row, behind your teenage cousins, in the corner. She told me I ruined the aesthetic of your family, and you let her. He flinched as if I had physically struck him. I am not asking for an apology anymore, I continued, leaning forward, holding his eyes. I'm asking for an investment. I am asking you to prove to me, on paper, that I am your family. Not her, not Donovan, me. I want my seat in the front row, Marcus. And if she won't give it to me on the lawn, I'm going to take it in the boardroom. Marcus stared at me for a long time. The silence in the dining room was absolute, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. He looked at the paperwork. He looked at the woman he married. He realized, perhaps for the first time, exactly who I was. I wasn't just a soft place for him to land. I was a fortress. He reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his fountain pen. He didn't say another word. He didn't argue. He didn't try to defend his mother. He flipped to the signature page, uncapped the pen, and signed his name on the line. He signed everything, every page, every addendum. He handed the folder back to me, his hands shaking slightly but his eyes resolute. File it, he said. I filed the legal transfer the next morning, a Thursday at 9 a.m., sharp with the county clerk and the state corporate registry. The trap was set, the ink was dry, the aesthetic was officially ruined. Now all I had to do was wait for the explosion. The explosion didn't happen immediately. The wheels of corporate bureaucracy turn slowly, even for the rich. But I knew exactly how and when it would detonate. Donovan, Marcus's older brother, was the operations manager. As part of his role, he received automated alerts from their corporate attorneys whenever a structural filing was updated in the state registry regarding the Whitfield family trust. The alert hit his inbox on Friday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee, my laptop open to a spreadsheet I wasn't really looking at. I was waiting. I had been waiting since Thursday. At exactly 11:43 a.m., my phone rang. It wasn't Donovan. It wasn't Gerald. It was Eleanor. Her name flashed on the screen, a digital warning beacon. I took a slow sip of my coffee, let it ring 3 times to establish that I was not eagerly awaiting her call, and then I picked up. "Good morning, Eleanor," I said, my voice bright, pleasant, and entirely unbothered. "Simone, no sweetheart, no dear, just my name," snapped like a whip. Her voice was trembling, but not with sadness. It was vibrating with the kind of pure, unadulterated rage that usually precedes a murder. "I need you to explain to me," Eleanor said, her words clipped and dangerously quiet. "Exactly what has happened with the company's legal documentation. Donovan just called me in a panic. He's telling me there's a new trust filing." "Ah," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs. "Yes, I assume Donovan saw the transfer notification. Marcus and I restructured his ownership stake into our joint asset portfolio. It's fairly routine for married couples. It streamlines our estate planning for the future." "That is not routine," Eleanor hissed, dropping the facade of Southern etiquette entirely. "That is not a joint asset. That is Marcus's inheritance. That company has been in this family for 31 years. Gerald and I built it from nothing. You have no right to attach your name to it." "And I am part of this family, Eleanor," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. Or was that also purely an aesthetic issue? A visual glitch you thought you could just hide in the background? Silence, It was a profound, heavy silence, long enough that I could hear her breathing shift. I could hear the exact moment her brain connected the dots. She realized this wasn't about money. This wasn't a greedy money grab. This was a direct, calculated, and devastatingly precise retaliation for the lawn. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she finally said. And her voice had gone somewhere colder and darker than I had ever heard it. The polished matriarch was gone. "I'm protecting my husband's interests," I said, my tone incredibly pleasant. "Which is what a wife does. I'm ensuring that our household has a legally recognized, undeniable stake in the asset he breaks his back managing every single day." "You cannot seriously intend to hold a stake in this company," she said. "You know nothing about this business. You are trying to steal from us because you got your feelings hurt over a photograph." "The filing is already complete, Eleanor," I reminded her gently. "It is public record. The ink is dry. The state has stamped it. There is no trying involved, it is done." I paused. I let the reality of that statement wash over her. I let her feel the panic of losing control. "But I want you to know something," I continued, my voice dropping the cheerful facade and becoming deadly serious. "I have absolutely no interest in dismantling what your family built. I really don't. I never did. I have a full-time career in finance that pays me incredibly well. I have my own independent assets. I don't need your company's money, Eleanor." "Then release the transfer," she demanded immediately. "Sign the reversal paperwork today." "I will," I said softly, "under one condition." Another silence. She didn't want to ask, but she had to. I had backed the queen into a corner, and she knew it. "What condition?" "At next year's family portrait," I said, enunciating every single syllable, "I sit in the front row, next to my husband, and every year after that. Furthermore, when the company's annual newsletter goes out this December, my name is included in the core family section, not as a footnote. Not hidden in a group paragraph as a named, recognized member of the Whitfield family." The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds, I know because I counted them by the ticking of the kitchen clock. 1, 2, 3. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she weighed her options. She could fight me in court, which would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, drag the company's name through public litigation, and she would likely lose anyway because Marcus had signed willingly. Or she could surrender the aesthetic. "That's your condition," she said finally, her voice hollow. "That's my condition. You're holding a third of my company hostage, over a photograph." The disbelief in her voice was almost comical. To her it was just a picture. To me it was a declaration of existence. "No, Eleanor," I said, my voice hardening to steel. "I'm doing all of this because you looked at me and saw a size, not a person. You looked at my body and decided I was unworthy of standing next to your son. I wanted you to understand that those two things are not the same. One of them sits in the back row. The other one owns 33.3% of your empire." She hung up. The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear, placed it on the marble counter, and finished my coffee. It was lukewarm, but it tasted like absolute victory. 2800 grok minus 3400 the negotiation and the 1-year mark. 40 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time it was Gerald. Gerald, Marcus's father, was a different kind of adversary. He wasn't malicious like Eleanor, he was pragmatic. He built the company. He understood the math. "Simone," he said, his voice quiet, careful, and deeply exhausted. "Marcus tells me he signed the papers himself." "He did, Gerald. Read them entirely. No coercion." Another long pause. I imagined Gerald sitting in his leather-bound study, rubbing his temples, realizing his wife's superficial cruelty had just compromised a third of his life's work. "Is he happy?" Gerald asked simply. "My son? Is he happy with you?" "Very," I said honestly, "and I plan to keep it that way." "I'll speak to Eleanor," Gerald said. "He didn't ask me to undo it. He didn't threaten me. He recognized a checkmate when he saw one. He knew I held the leverage, and he knew why I had done it." Gerald, unlike his wife, respected power. I will never know exactly what was said in the Whitfield estate that weekend. I will never know how much Gerald yelled, or if Donovan threw a tantrum, or how many crystal glasses Eleanor shattered. I was not privy to the collapse of her regime. But 2 days later, on a Sunday evening, Eleanor called back. Her voice had no warmth. None of that fake, dripping Southern sweetness. but it also lacked the cold, venomous rage from Friday. It was something in between. It was the sound of a woman who had been defeated, and who was smart enough to know when to fold her hand. From Eleanor, this was the closest thing to respect I would ever receive. Next October, she said flatly. Front row. Thank you, Eleanor. Don't thank me, she snapped, a tiny flare of her old self breaking through. Just keep my son happy. And keep your nose out of my company's daily operations. I always planned to, I said. And that was it. The war was over. The treaty was signed in the blood of corporate equity. Fast forward 1 year. The first Saturday of October. The Huntersville property was as manicured and flawless as ever. The sky was the same piercing blue. The leaves were turning the exact same shade of gold. Kezia, the high-end photographer, was setting up her lighting rigs near the massive oak tree. I walked out of my house that morning and pulled a dress from its garment bag. It was the burgundy dress, the exact same heavy silk crepe dress from the year before. The same seamstress, the same sweeping skirt. The only difference was that I had had it let out half an inch in the shoulders, because I had spent the last 12 months lifting weights, and my shoulders had gotten broader, a physical change I considered a massive personal victory. I paired it with a dark, berry-colored lipstick and a smile that could cut glass. When Marcus and I arrived at the estate, the lawn was bustling with the same aunts, uncles, and cousins. But the atmosphere was different. The air was charged. Word of the corporate restructuring had inevitably leaked through the family gossip mill, heavily sanitized by Eleanor, of course. But the core truth remained. I was no longer just the fat wife. I was a stakeholder. Marcus took my hand as we walked out onto the lawn. His grip was firm, solid, and completely unapologetic. He had grown a spine over the last year. Funny how almost losing your wife and your inheritance in the same week will do that to a man. Eleanor was standing by the chairs. She was wearing a silver-tailored pantsuit this time. She held no clipboard. She watched me approach in the burgundy dress. I knew she recognized it. I saw her jaw tighten, just for a fraction of a second, before her face smoothed into a neutral mask. She began directing the positioning. Gerald, center, Donovan, right. When she got to us, she didn't look at Kezia's monitor. She didn't talk about symmetry or visual weight or silhouettes. She simply raised her hand and pointed to the 2 chairs directly beside Gerald, front row, center left, next to Marcus. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The chairs were there waiting for us. Priscilla was seated 3 chairs down, wearing a pale pink dress. She looked at me, then looked away. Her perfectly manicured hands folded tightly in her lap. She offered a tight, teeth-baring smile. I smiled back, genuinely and broadly. Kezia photographed the family for 40 minutes. I sat next to my husband. My shoulders were broad, my dress was dark and beautiful, and my presence was undeniable. I did not blend into the shadows. I did not tuck myself away. I anchored the frame. When the photos came back 3 weeks later, I was in every single core family shot. Unobscured, front and center. The annual newsletter went out in December, under the heading The Whitfield Family. A Legacy of Excellence. My name was listed right next to Marcus's, printed in thick, bold, gold-embossed ink. As for the legal transfer, it remains in place. I never reversed it. I told Eleanor I would release it if she met my conditions, but legally, a verbal promise is not a binding contract in the face of a notarized trust document. I decided that the 33% stake was an excellent insurance policy. It sits there, untouched, accumulating value. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder. It is the invisible elephant in the room at every Thanksgiving dinner, every Christmas morning, every company gala. It hangs over Eleanor's head, ensuring that she never, ever forgets her manners. Marcus thinks it's fair. He knows I will never touch the money unless provoked, and he finally understands that my boundary was necessary to save our marriage. I think in a twisted way, Gerald respects me more for keeping it. And Eleanor? Eleanor has learned to live with it in the private, quiet part of herself, where she keeps the lessons she was forced to learn the hard way. I don't need her validation anymore. Honestly, I stopped needing it the exact moment I sat in the back row a year ago and decided what to do about it. People like Eleanor believe that power is visual. They believe power is being the thinnest person in the room, or having the most expensive lawn, or controlling the aesthetic of a photograph. But true power isn't about how you look in the light. It's about what you can dismantle in the dark. What I need, I build. What I deserve, I document. And what I will accept from a family portrait, a mother-in-law, or anything else in this life I decide. Not anyone's mother, mine.